Speaker.
Simon O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to take a call on the second reading of the Radiation Safety Bill. Can I begin by acknowledging the Speaker who's just sat down, but also other members of the Health Select Committee. I've often said that we're quite collegial in our proceedings, and I think this bill is a good example of working together. Perhaps there was a point of commonality, and certainly with myself, of complete and utter lack of knowledge in this space, not an electrical engineer, physicist or anything. That hurts, that hurts. That hurt. I know, it's just so hurtful, really. We work very well together in this space because actually it was, as both previous speakers have mentioned, a very, very technical piece of legislation. And I too want to thank the officials who led us through that, articulating these concepts that lay people could understand, and I suspect at times displaying great patience as we continue to ask the same questions over and over as we try to get our head around it. But I think if, for those listening to understand too that while lay people might sit on this committee, we work very hard to understand the concepts which we are ultimately putting into law. So my thanks to the officials, my thanks to the committee. One of the things which keeps coming up, and I want to assure the public, is again that distinction between ionising and non-ionising radiation. I think often when there's a little bit of uncertainty in these spaces, it generates a lot of concern for people. Look, this bill deals with ionising radiation. As the Honourable Annette King mentioned, we're dealing with things like gamma rays, beta rays, X-rays and so forth. Like it's energies or particles of energies which make material and substantial differences. And that's distinctly different in a physical sense from what you'd expect from visible light sources, ultraviolet light, radio waves, what's coming out of your cell phone at the moment, TV screens and the like. We are not in this bill wanting to regulate the latter. One that's not so much an exception, but I recall one submitter, in fact the first gentleman who submitted pointed out the issue of smoke detectors, where they fit. In fact, that was something which we have very quickly looked at and come to the right space in that area. As those of you who may, take the time walking through the corridors of your house will note that actually we are using ionising radiation in that space. And so how we deal with that appropriately is important. As also has been mentioned, this is about bringing the legislation up to speed to current practice. Have to admit, I wasn't around in 1965. I'll have to turn to some older members. I won't mention which party. I know. Experience. But also bringing ourselves towards those international obligations. No, look, the milkman hadn't even turned down the street in 1965. That said, I was born in an era where we still had black and white television and only 2 channels. And you didn't know we're also here, Mr. Speaker, to bring ourselves in line with international obligations, and that's quite important. Look, a couple of things I think we need to very quickly touch on. This bill ensures that appropriate security measures are in place when handling radiation. This is not sort of opening the doors, some sort of carte blanche approach. It's also about setting codes of practice which will ultimately guide the way we deal with radiation. And those codes have to be renewed or reviewed every 5 years. One really important element is that an institution now using ionising radiation needs a single source licence. So the Minister talked about DHBs, where they might, of course, have an X-ray machine, a CT scanning machine, an MRI and so forth. We're not expecting the DHB to hold a licence for each of those items. They themselves can hold a source licence to be able to use ionising radiation. And very much the same is true for universities. The other thing I'll touch on, because there's a lot of technical changes we've made, but the other one is around ancillary services. So you might have an MRI machine, there's a source licence, obviously, to use it, but you may need at times to send parts overseas, in particular to get the ancillary or support services. In the original drafting of the bill, it looked like we might have to regulate or provide some sort of approvals for people outside of New Zealand to actually help support the work of those MRI machines. We've decided that doesn't really make much sense, practically speaking. So we have tightened up the regulations to make it very clear that the source licence will also enable people to use ancillary services overseas to help with those machines. There's a few exceptions around our defence forces and their use as well. I think that's important to note. But look, overall, this is a very good bill. I thank members again for their overarching support and look forward to this moving to committee stage.
Lewis Award.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker, tēnā koutou katoa. Manako